When they labeled me unauthorized visitor, I almost turned back. Then I heard a tour guide's voice echo down the marble hallway, describing the artifact I had built with my own hands, and calling it the work of an unknown hero. For 40 years I kept my silence. Back then, I was just Sergeant Lisa Carter, U.S. Army Signal Intelligence, Cold War Division. They said women were better at typing than transmitting. So I let them think I was a secretary while I sat behind encrypted radios and sent the coordinates that saved men I would never meet. I promised myself I'd never speak of it again. Classified missions don't come with applause, only ghosts. But when that exhibit opened last winter, I received an invitation, and one line on the bottom changed everything. Recovered device checkpoint Berlin 1983. I knew that serial number. It was the machine I had built, hidden under a false name, the one they told me never existed. And now, strangers were standing around it, praising the genius of a man who never touched it. So I walked into that museum, gray hair, steady cane, and every eye turned toward the fraud. What none of them knew was that the artifact still carried my signal. If you believe some heroes were erased only because they kept their vow of silence, like, share, and subscribe to military revenge. Because tonight, for the first time, I'm breaking mine. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning, tucked between utility bills and a veteran's newsletter that I never had the heart to unsubscribe from. The subject line was short and formal, just 7 words that made my chest tighten. Museum of Intelligence Heritage. Formal invitation. I thought it was some kind of alumni spam or maybe one of those donation drives pretending to care about Cold War veterans. But when I opened it, the screen went white for a second before the text appeared. There was only one paragraph. It read, Mrs. Lisa Carter, you are cordially invited to the opening exhibition of the Silent Frequency, featuring recovered communication devices from Berlin 1983. Attached below was an image. A small gray radio unit, dented, scratched, and tagged with a label that made my fingers go numb, recovered from Checkpoint Berlin 83. The clock on my kitchen wall ticked once, sharp and loud. I clicked the image open and zoomed in. There it was, the mark I had carved with a screwdriver the night the signal finally broke through. LC-47. I had carved it out of habit, half superstition, half proof that I had existed. The device they found was mine, but the credit wasn't. My breath caught in my throat like static. I sat there for a long time, staring at the grainy photograph, the way the metal caught the light, the faint burn marks near the frequency dial. It looked like it had survived the fire. It had. We all had, at least for a while, for years. I told myself I was fine being forgotten. I told myself I had chosen silence because that was what duty meant. You did your part, then you vanished so others could live loudly. But that picture made something shift. I hadn't seen that machine since 1983, the night I transmitted the coordinates that pulled 6 trapped soldiers out of East Berlin, while half the city believed they were already dead. After that, the mission was sealed. My clearance was revoked. My name erased from the roster. I became a file marked irrelevant. The war ended. The Cold War turned cold again, and I learned to bake bread, fix leaks, and mind my own ghosts. I closed my laptop and leaned back in my chair. Outside, the morning light slid across the faded blinds, painting stripes on the kitchen floor. The radio on the counter played a song from the 70s. I caught a lyric halfway through, something about time catching up. I smiled without meaning to. Maybe it finally had. For the next few minutes, I tried to convince myself not to go. What does it matter now? No one at that museum would know my face. The people who had worked beside me were long gone, some buried, some lost in paperwork. And yet, a part of me couldn't look away from that image. That little box had once been the heartbeat of a mission that no one was supposed to remember. Now it was sitting under glass somewhere, being called a relic. I wondered what story they would tell about it. Probably something polished, sanitized. A tale about brave men and their equipment. That's what I had been once. Disposable, replaceable, unseen. The invitation said the exhibit would open in 3 days. Hartford, Connecticut. Only 2 hours by train. I reread it 5 times before closing the laptop. For the rest of the day, I kept moving through my small apartment like a ghost. Made coffee. Fed the cat. I checked the weather. Pretended none of it meant anything. But every time I passed the table, the image flashed in my mind. The smell of metal. The heat from the transmitter when it is overloaded. The voice of the captain breaking through the static, shouting coordinates and disbelief all at once. Then the silence after. That silence had followed me home for 40 years. By evening, I sat at my old desk with a notepad in front of me. I wrote a list the way I used to before every mission. Train time. Arrival. Hotel near the museum. I didn't even know why I was writing. Maybe a habit. Maybe longing. The truth is, once you've lived long enough in the shadows, curiosity becomes dangerous. It makes you look back when you promised you'd only move forward. But that photograph had opened something in me that I thought was long buried. A pulse of unfinished business. That night, I dreamed of static. It filled every corner of the room, a low, humming sound that grew louder until it became the shape of a woman's voice whispering numbers. I woke up sweating, the taste of code still on my tongue. The next morning, I packed a small bag. I told no one I was leaving. There wasn't anyone left to tell. My son worked overseas. My husband passed away 10 years ago. My only company most days was the cat, and she didn't ask questions. I left a bowl of food, a note that said back soon, and walked out before I could change my mind. The train ride was quiet. Most people buried themselves in phones and earbuds. I watched the landscape blur past, towns dissolving into open fields, the sun catching on power lines like memory trying to hold on. Every time the train crossed a bridge, I felt that faint tremor in my chest. The same one I'd felt each time we transmitted a message and waited for a reply. Except now there was no reply, just the rhythm of rails and the sound of old ghosts shifting in their seats. I arrived in Hartford just before noon. The museum stood on a hill overlooking the river, a tall stone building that used to be part of a military academy. The banners out front read the silent frequency. Inside, people moved in slow clusters, their voices soft and careful, the way people speak in places that hold secrets. I hesitated by the entrance, hands still on the strap of my bag. I almost turned back. Then I caught sight of a display poster near the ticket desk. It showed the same device from the email. The caption read Prototype Cipher Radio Model Unknown Designer Classified 1983. For a moment, I stood there listening to the faint hum of air conditioning and distant footsteps. My reflection stared back from the glass case nearby. Gray hair, lined face, the kind of expression that comes from years of keeping things in. Behind that reflection, a row of black and white photos of Cold War agents stared back at me. I recognized 2 of them. Both had been briefed by me in '82. Both had died before the wall came down. The supervisor arrived a minute later, younger than my grandson would be. Sharp suit, clipboard, quick smile that didn't quite reach the eyes. "Mrs. Carter, I'm afraid there's been a mix-up. The guest list was provided by the Department of Records, and your name doesn't appear in their files. You're welcome to view the exhibit as a visitor, but I can't grant you access to the private reception." I nodded, said it was fine, thanked him for checking. It wasn't fine, but arguing wouldn't change the past. The truth is, I'd spent most of my life being told I wasn't in the file. I was used to it. I bought a general ticket and walked past the rope line. The exhibit space opened into a long gallery filled with dim light and quiet music that sounded like distant static. Glass cases lined the walls, each holding a piece of history someone had once sworn didn't exist. Radios, transmitters, decoder sheets, all labeled with careful words like alleged or possibly recovered. I moved slowly, reading each description, my fingers twitching the way they used to before sending a signal. And then I saw it. The radio. My radio. It sat in the center of the room under a halo of light. I froze. For a second the air seemed to thin around me. My feet carried me closer until I could see every detail of the metal casing, the worn knobs, the scratches that told a story no curator could ever know. There it was, LC-47, still faint but visible. My initials, carved like a whisper that had survived the years. I placed my hand on the glass. not touching but close enough to feel the chill radiating from it. The label RID found near Checkpoint Berlin, believed to be used by American intelligence for clandestine operations during the height of Cold War tensions. Anonymous contribution, donated by the H.T. Reeves collection. That name hit me harder than I expected. Reeves. Colonel Henry T. Reeves. My commanding officer. The man who told me to forget everything I'd done. The man who signed the memo that stripped my clearance and buried my work under layers of red tape. He was the one who had told me once. And I can still hear it, Lisa. History only remembers the names printed in ink, not the ones written in pencil. I stared at that label and felt something inside me harden. Maybe it was anger. Maybe it was clarity. Either way, I knew I hadn't come here just to look. I came because some signals deserve to be heard again. Some stories can only stay buried until someone who lived them walks back into the room. If you're listening and you've ever wondered what happens when truth outlives the lies, hit like, share this story, and stay close. The signal isn't done yet. I stood before the glass until the world behind me blurred into whispers. Then a man's voice came from my left. Low, smooth, confident. Strange how authority always sounds the same no matter the decade. Beautiful piece, isn't it? I turned. A man in his 40s stood there, dark suit, polished shoes, the kind of posture that says he knows who signs the checks. He wore a badge that read Dr. Thomas Reeves, curator. My stomach tightened before my mind caught up. Reeves. Of course he noticed my glance. You seem familiar with the equipment, he said, smiling like someone humoring a curious tourist. I looked back at the radio and chose my words carefully. Familiar enough, he chuckled softly. Most visitors just see an old box of wires, but this model helped define an era. Developed by a brilliant man working in Berlin, though the records don't give a name. Probably for security reasons. I almost laughed. Security had always been a convenient word for erasure. I asked, "Do you know who donated it?" He nodded toward the label. The Reeves collection. My father served in the intelligence division back then. He kept some artifacts from his service. After he passed, I cataloged them for the museum. I froze. Colonel Reeves was his father. The air around us grew heavy with things unsaid. He went on, unaware of the weight of his own words. Father used to tell me stories about brave men who operated these under impossible conditions. Said they were the backbone of communication during the Cold War. Never mentioned a woman, of course. He smiled again, polite, dismissive. The way men used to smile at me in briefing rooms. The way they do when they believe you belong in the margins. I stepped closer to the case. That mark there, I said quietly. LC-47. Did your records mention who made it? He leaned in, squinting, then shrugged. Probably an inspection code. Nothing significant. I nodded, feeling something inside me settle into resolve. You're right. Nothing significant. Not yet. He looked at me more closely now, studying my face as if trying to match me to a file photo he didn't have. Forgive me, he said. Are you a historian? Retired communications officer, I replied. Army. He smiled with polite approval. Ah, well then you'll appreciate the craftsmanship. Real engineering back then. His eyes flicked to my name tag. Lisa Carter. Doesn't ring a bell, but I'm sure my father would have admired your service. The words came out before I could stop them. He admired it so much he erased it. The smile faltered. Excuse me? I pointed at the device. That radio wasn't built by a brilliant man in Berlin. It was built by a woman in a concrete basement outside Frankfurt. I was that woman. The LC-47 isn't an inspection mark. It's my initials and the mission code. Your father ordered me to destroy the prototype after the extraction. Instead, I hid it. I never expected to see it again. For a moment, silence. Then he laughed, soft and courteous. That's quite a story, Mrs. Carter. You should share it at the Veterans Center. The crowd loves that sort of thing. I didn't move. I just met his eyes and let the quiet speak for itself. His confidence wavered. Look, I appreciate your passion, but this artifact has been verified through proper channels. We don't change plaques because someone feels attached to the past. Proper channels. That phrase again. The same one his father had used when he signed my dismissal. I said sometimes the channels are clogged. He frowned, probably unused to defiance, wrapped in calm. Behind us, a few visitors had drifted closer, drawn by tone more than words. Reeves noticed the attention and straightened his jacket. "If you'll excuse me, ma'am, the reception is starting shortly, and this section is reserved for invited guests." He gestured toward the rope line. I pulled the folded email from my bag and held it out. "Your invitation," I said. "It came from this museum." He glanced at it, then motioned to a security guard. "Check this, please." The guard took the paper, examined it, and murmured something into his earpiece. Reeves looked back at me with that polished courtesy that cuts sharper than anger. "I'm sorry, but this appears to be a generic message from an old mailing list. You weren't formally invited. I'm afraid you'll have to remain in the public area." The guard hesitated, unsure. I turned to him. "It's fine, son. I've been escorted out of better rooms than this." The crowd tittered softly, not sure whether to pity or applaud. Reeves flushed but recovered quickly. He nodded to the guard, who stepped aside, awkward. I started to walk away, then stopped at the edge of the light. I said, "Tell me, Dr. Reeves, when you speak about this radio tonight, what will you say?" Blinked. "That it represents the courage of unnamed agents who kept the world safe." I nodded. "Then at least say this: sometimes courage wears the wrong uniform." I left him standing there, confusion flickering behind his composure. My hands trembled as I walked toward the hallway, but it wasn't fear, it was something cleaner, older. The tremor of a signal trying to break through. In the lobby, I found a bench near the window and sat down. The winter light spilled across the marble floor, pale and cold. I could still hear snippets of the curator's voice, echoing faintly from the next room as he greeted the guests. His guests. I thought of his father again, the last time I saw him, leaning over the console while alarms screamed through the bunker. He had grabbed the transmitter from my hands and barked that I was overstepping. Later, he would report that he had completed the transmission himself. I hadn't argued then either. I had been 28 and tired of shouting into static. A woman with a museum badge approached me, offering a program and a polite smile. "Are you staying for the dedication speech?" I told her I might. She handed me the brochure. On the front was the same photo of the radio. Inside, under acknowledgments, the name Colonel Henry T. Reeves appeared in bold print. Beneath it, a quote: "History favors the disciplined mind over the sentimental heart." I traced the line with my finger, the paper rough against my skin. In the distance, applause broke out. Reeves must have started his speech. I rose slowly, drawn back toward the sound. The gallery lights dimmed to spotlight the center display. He stood beside my radio, microphone in hand, speaking to a semicircle of guests dressed in suits and medals. He was telling them about courage, about innovation, about the genius of his late father, who had preserved these treasures. I lingered at the back of the crowd. His words washed over me, polished and empty. He quoted data from declassified files. He talked about strategy and code names. And then, with a smile practiced in the mirror, he said, "My father always believed that the soul of intelligence work lies in precision, not emotion. That's why these instruments matter. They remind us of discipline, not drama." The audience nodded. I felt something inside me crack, quiet but final. I stepped forward before I knew I was moving. My voice carried farther than I expected. "Then he never understood the work at all." Heads turned. The curator blinked, startled. "Excuse me, ma'am, this is a closed event." I kept walking until I stood near the barrier. "You're right about one thing," I said. "Precision matters. But without compassion, precision just makes better silence." Gasps murmured through the guests. Someone whispered my name, though none of them should have known it. Reeves forced a smile. "Ma'am, please, we can discuss your concerns privately after the ceremony." I looked straight at him. "You've discussed them privately for 40 years. Maybe it's time people heard the rest." I pointed to the display. That radio sent one signal on March 3, 1983. The transmission came from an underground post near Frankfurt. The operator was a woman. The coordinates saved 6 American soldiers trapped behind the wall. When the rescue team returned, they filed a report. The report was sealed under Project Aurora, and the woman was told her service was classified. Reeves's jaw tightened. That information isn't in our records. I nodded. I know. That's the problem. The guests whispered among themselves. One elderly man, wearing a veteran's pin, stepped closer. Ma'am, are you saying you were that operator? I met his gaze. I'm saying I was in that room when those men came home. Reeves raised a hand toward security, but the older veteran waved them off. Let her speak, he said quietly. The room hushed. My heart pounded once, then steadied. I told them how the signal had broken through after hours of static. How we'd rerouted the antenna through a damaged generator. How we lost contact and tried again, not because of orders, but because we could hear the panic in the captain's voice. I described the moment the coordinates transmitted, the seconds that felt like hours, and the silence that followed when the enemy jammed our line. The crowd listened. Even Reeves had stopped moving. I finished softly. That silence was the sound of 6 men staying alive. And when it was over, your father said no one needed to know who sent the message. He said the mission was his to report. For a long time, no one spoke. Then the veteran said, I was there. Checkpoint Berlin. We were the ones you saved. He turned to Reeves. That voice over the radio wasn't a man's. I'll never forget it. Reeves's face was drained of color. He stammered something about confidentiality, about misunderstanding. The veteran shook his head. You've been showing that radio for months, he said. And you never bothered to ask whose hands built it. The room fell into a hush heavy enough to feel. Reeves opened his mouth, then closed it again. I took a breath, my throat dry. I didn't come here to humiliate anyone. I came to remember the truth. The man who raised you taught discipline. I hope you learn honesty. I turned to leave. The guests parted without a word. The sound of my footsteps echoed against the marble floor. Halfway to the door, I stopped and looked back one last time at the glass case. The radio sat there, still under its beam of light, humming in memory. The label still read unknown designer. But for the first time in decades, I didn't feel erased. Outside, the air was a bit cold against my face. Snow had started to fall soft and slow. I walked down the steps, each one lighter than the last. Somewhere behind me, through the museum's open doors, I heard faint applause, uncertain, scattered, but real. Maybe it was a pity, maybe respect. It didn't matter. What mattered was the signal had finally reached home. Truth doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just waits for the right frequency. If this story moved you, share it with someone who still believes silence can bury the brave. And subscribe to Military Revenge, because next, you'll hear what that applause turned into. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my old landline ringing. Few people called me on it anymore, but I kept it because it reminded me of a time when voices mattered more than messages. The caller ID flashed a number from Hartford. I knew before I picked up that it would be about the museum. A woman's voice came through. Careful and polite, Mrs. Carter. This is Elaine from the Museum of Intelligence Heritage. The board would like to speak with you regarding yesterday's incident. Could you return to the museum this afternoon at 2 o'clock? Her tone balanced courtesy with control, the way government voices often do when they expect compliance. I told her I would be there. When I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a while, watching sunlight slide across the linoleum floor. The cat hopped onto the chair beside me and purred like nothing in the world had changed. I envied her peace. By noon, I had packed a small folder of old documents, yellowed pages that had traveled with me through decades of silence. Some were personal letters, others fragments of reports that had escaped the shredder. None of it was official proof, but each page carried a trace of the life they said I never lived. I tucked them into my bag, not as weapons, but as reminders that I had once been more than a name erased from a file. The train ride back felt shorter this time. The rhythm of the rails steadied my nerves. When I stepped onto the platform, a thin wind carried the smell of iron and old rain. The museum loomed on the hill, silent and bright against a pale winter sky. I could see the banners still fluttering outside, the silent frequency. For the first time, the words felt personal. At the entrance, the same security guard from yesterday stood beside the scanner. His face tightened when he recognized me. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said. I handed him the note from the board's office. He read it, nodded, then stepped aside. "Please wait here while I confirm." He made a quick call, his voice low and respectful. I could tell he was trying to be kind, but there was unease in the way he glanced at me. I'd seen that look before, on young soldiers ordered to guard doors they didn't understand. A few minutes later, the curator appeared, Dr. Reeves. His expression was calm, though his eyes carried the kind of exhaustion that comes from a night spent rewriting history. "Mrs. Carter, thank you for coming," he said. "The board appreciates your cooperation." I followed him down the hallway. The sound of our footsteps echoed against the polished floor. He led me into a small conference room overlooking the courtyard. The blinds were half drawn, the light thin and cold. 3 people sat at the table, 2 men and a woman, all wearing the kind of practiced neutrality you only find in institutions. Reeves introduced them as members of the museum's board. They nodded politely. The woman spoke first. "Mrs. Carter, we understand there was some confusion during yesterday's event. We simply wish to clarify the record and ensure that our exhibition materials remain accurate." I told her that was all I wanted too. Reeves cleared his throat. "We reviewed the archival data," he said. "According to Department of Defense records, there is no file listing you as a commissioned officer in the Signal Intelligence Division. The last trace of your employment status appears under civilian contractor, terminated in 1985. He looked at me measured. That would explain the misunderstanding. The word contractor landed like a slap, even after all these years. I said quietly, "That's what your father called me too, when he took my work." The woman on the board shifted uncomfortably. "Mrs. Carter," she began, "surely you understand how memory can blur details over time. These records are decades old." I smiled without humor. "Memory doesn't blur when it's all you have left." Reeves tried to soften his tone. "We're not questioning your sincerity, but history requires documentation, not recollection." I reached into my bag and laid one of the old reports on the table. The paper was brittle, corners frayed. The ink faded to gray. There was my handwriting on the margin, the same looped initials LC. This was part of the mission log from March 1983. The coordinates transmitted that night matched the ones filed under Project Aurora. I may not have been in the final report, but the radio still carries my mark. The older man on the board adjusted his glasses and leaned in. His voice was quiet. "Even if that's true, Mrs. Carter, we can't alter an official exhibit without verification from the Department of Defense. Until then, your claim remains anecdotal." Reeves nodded slightly, like a man grateful for backup. I looked around the table at their careful faces. In another life, I had sat in similar rooms, except back then the men wore uniforms instead of suits. The language was always the same though. Verification, procedure, protocol. Words designed to keep truth waiting in the hallway. I gathered the papers and placed them back in my bag. Then I said something I hadn't planned. "You know what the difference is between a file and a person? A file stays quiet when it's locked. A person doesn't." Reeves shifted in his seat. "Mrs. Carter, we're simply trying to maintain professional standards." I nodded. Professional standards, like the ones that erased women from mission reports because their voices didn't sound authoritative enough over the radio. The room fell still. The woman on the board folded her hands and said, "We're sorry if you feel slighted, but our responsibility is to protect the integrity of the institution." I looked at her and said, "Sometimes integrity starts with listening." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Reeves rose, smoothing his jacket. "Perhaps we can continue this once we receive confirmation from the department." He opened the door, signaling the meeting was over. I stood slowly, my knees aching. I had spent a lifetime walking away from closed doors. This time I paused on the threshold. I said, "Dr. Reeves, that machine you display downstairs still remembers me even if your records do not." He frowned, uncertain what I meant. "Machines don't remember," he said. "They just store data." I smiled. "Then you've never heard one speak." He didn't answer. The board members exchanged puzzled glances. I walked out before they could ask more. In the hallway, the air smelled faintly of polish and dust, the scent of stories kept too long behind glass. Outside the main gallery, A group of visitors stood around the exhibit again. Children pressed their faces to the glass, fascinated by the knobs and wires. A guide was explaining how intelligence officers once used Morse code to send encrypted messages. His voice was bright and eager, like someone telling a fairy tale. I stood at the edge, listening. When he finished, a little boy raised his hand and asked if the radio still worked. The guide laughed. "No, son, these are just relics now. They don't make a sound." The boy nodded, disappointed. I stepped closer and said softly, "Sometimes they do." The guide turned, startled, recognizing me from the night before. I could see the question forming in his eyes, but I didn't wait for it. I moved closer to the glass and looked at the device again. The light above it flickered once, a faint pulse across the metal surface. For an instant, I thought I heard something beneath the hum of the room. A low, broken whisper of static. It was probably the air vent or my imagination, but it felt real enough to raise the hair on my arms. I pressed my hand against the glass. The vibration was subtle but there. The machine spoke before I did. A small smile tugged at my lips. Maybe ghosts don't haunt places. Maybe they haunt frequencies. I turned away, but not before catching the reflection of Reeves in the glass doorway behind me. He had been watching. His face looked pale, uncertain. Our eyes met through the reflection, and for the first time, he didn't look like a curator or a scholar. He looked like a man standing at the edge of a story he no longer controlled. That night, back at the hotel, I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window with the lamp off, watching headlights move along the distant highway. Somewhere out there, 1,000 invisible signals crossed paths, carrying voices that no one would ever hear. I thought about the boy asking if the radio still worked. Maybe someday he would grow up and learn that history doesn't always speak through textbooks. Sometimes it speaks through people who refuse to forget. I poured myself a small cup of tea and let the steam warm my hands. On the table, my phone buzzed with a new message. Unknown number. It said, "Mrs. Carter, this is Elaine. The board wants to see you again tomorrow morning. There's been a development." I stared at the screen, feeling that same pulse of static again, deep in my chest. I typed a short reply. "I'll be there." As I set the phone down, I whispered to the quiet room. The signal isn't finished. Some truths need a second transmission before they're finally heard. If this story reaches you, click like or leave a comment. I promise the next message will travel even deeper. The next morning the museum looked different. Not brighter, not friendlier, just different in that way a place feels when it knows you're coming back with questions. The guard at the entrance recognized me but didn't stop me this time. He just nodded and stepped aside, as if something about yesterday had unsettled him too. Inside, the corridors were quieter than before. The air had that Sunday stillness, even though it was only Thursday. Elaine met me near the reception desk. Her smile was tight, but her voice was softer than the day before. "Mrs. Carter, thank you for coming again on short notice. The board would like to discuss a recent finding. Please follow me." She led me down the same hallway as yesterday, past portraits of men in uniforms that still tried to look heroic through dust and time. When we reached the conference room, the blinds were open this time, letting the pale winter sun wash across the table. Reeves was already there, standing by the window, his posture stiff. The board members from before sat across from him, but something about their expressions had changed. Not confidence. Not exactly guilt either. More like they'd been made to see something they couldn't unsee. Elaine closed the door and took a seat. The woman who had spoken the day before cleared her throat. "Mrs. Carter, we appreciate your patience. Overnight, our technical department conducted an inspection of the device you identified. Standard protocol before any adjustments to the exhibit." She glanced at Reeves, who was avoiding eye contact. "During the inspection, the team discovered an anomaly in the unit's circuitry." I stayed silent. She continued, "The radio still carries a fragment of an audio transmission from March 1983. It was assumed to be corrupted static, but when the file was enhanced, a short segment became audible." She nodded to Reeves. He hesitated, then pressed play on a small recorder sitting on the table. At first, only a faint hiss. then a woman's voice, steady but urgent, cutting through the static. Coordinates 7193, repeat 7193, and then, softer, almost lost in the noise, God help them. The room went silent except for the soft hum of the recorder. I knew that voice. I'd lived inside it for decades. Reeves stopped the playback. The older man from the board spoke quietly. We cross-checked the coordinates. They matched the location of a documented extraction on that exact date. His voice trailed off, leaving the rest unsaid. No one moved. I could feel every heartbeat in my chest like a drum. Reeves finally spoke, his voice low. That voice. It's yours, isn't it? He nodded once. He ran a hand over his face, the air of confidence gone. My father must have. He stopped, words failing him. The woman on the board whispered, "We verified the audio signature against the remaining archive of personnel communications from Frankfurt base. The match is conclusive, Mrs. Carter. You transmitted that message." For the first time, I didn't need to argue. The proof was speaking for itself. Reeves sank into a chair. He looked smaller than the man I'd met 2 days ago. My father used to play a recording for me when I was little. Just static and a few words. He said it was from a mission that saved lives. I never knew. He didn't finish the sentence. I sat down slowly. The chair creaked. I looked at the recorder still on the table, then back at him. Some people spend their lives chasing glory, Dr. Reeves. Others just try to make sure the message gets through. He nodded, eyes glistening. I can't apologize enough. I truly didn't know. The woman from the board straightened her papers, trying to regain structure. Mrs. Carter, we intend to update the exhibit immediately. Your name and rank will be added to the display. The Department of Defense will receive our findings today. I smiled faintly. Do what you need to, but don't call it mine. Call it what it really was. A signal from a forgotten hand. The older man cleared his throat. The department will likely want to debrief you about the mission. Are you willing to cooperate? He laughed softly, not out of amusement but out of disbelief. I've been cooperating since 1975. You're just now catching up. Elaine tried to hide a smile. The tension in the room eased a little. Reeves looked down at his hands. There was something almost boyish in the way he said it. My father taught me history was written by those who stayed in the room. He was wrong. You were in the room all along, and we just didn't see it. For a while no one said anything. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the window panes. The sound reminded me of radio static. When I stood to leave, the woman asked if I'd like to attend the press announcement scheduled for the next day. I told her I'd think about it. Public recognition was never the point. I'd come for the truth, and the truth had finally spoken. In the hallway, Reeves caught up with me. Mrs. Carter, may I ask something? I stopped. He looked at me, hesitant. How did you know it was still inside the machine? The recording, I mean. I thought about it for a moment. I didn't, I said. But signals leave echoes. You just have to listen differently. He nodded, not entirely understanding, but trying to. We walked together to the entrance. Before I stepped outside, he said quietly, "Thank you for reminding me what this work is supposed to mean." I told him it wasn't about thanks. It was about finally tuning into the right frequency. Outside. The cold hit me harder than before, but it felt cleaner. The kind of air that clears the fog in your chest. Across the street, I noticed a small crowd gathered near the museum steps. Reporters maybe, or curious visitors drawn by rumor. A young woman with a notepad approached. "Ma'am, is it true the radio played a lost message?" I smiled politely. "It's true that some stories take a while to find their voice." She asked for my name, I said. "Just write down that the signal finally made it home." I walked past her and down the block. Each step felt lighter, not because I'd been vindicated, but because I no longer had to carry the silence alone. Later that evening, back at my hotel, I turned on the small bedside radio. It crackled to life between frequencies, that familiar hum filling the room. I didn't tune it right away. I just listened to the space between stations. Somewhere in that static, I could almost hear her again, the younger version of me, the one who believed that doing the right thing was enough, even if no one ever knew. My phone buzzed with new notifications. Messages from veterans I hadn't spoken to in years. Some thanked me. Others said they remembered. One simply wrote, "We heard you." I sat there with tears in my eyes and whispered back, "I heard you too." Sometimes truth waits for the right generation to have ears for it. If this story speaks to you, hit like, share, or subscribe to Military Revenge. The next chapter reveals what happened when the government called the next morning. Some signals never rest. The next morning came gray and slow, the kind of winter light that makes even the clock hesitate. I had planned to stay away from the museum that day, to let the news settle on its own. But before I could even pour my first cup of coffee, the phone rang again. It was Elaine. Her tone was different this time, lighter but tense underneath. "Mrs. Carter, the museum would like you to attend today's public dedication. They're planning to replay the recovered recording as part of the ceremony." I didn't answer right away. My eyes wandered to the window, to the frost gathering along the edges. After 40 years of silence, my voice was about to echo through a hall full of strangers. I told her I'd be there. By the time I arrived, the steps outside the museum were lined with reporters and veterans. The news had already spread. A small crowd stood by the entrance, some holding miniature flags, others clutching programs with the exhibit's new label, Operation Aurora, 1983. Inside, the gallery glowed brighter than before. Cameras had been set up along the aisles. Reeves was near the podium, looking like a man trying to balance pride and remorse all at once. When he saw me, he nodded respectfully. The ceremony began with short speeches from local officials, all the usual phrases about service, sacrifice, and remembrance. Their voices blurred into a polite hum until Reeves stepped up to the microphone. His voice trembled just enough to sound human. He spoke about the importance of truth, about the people who serve quietly and vanish from the record. Then he said, "Today, we honor one of those voices." He gestured toward the display case. The radio sat under its soft light, still dented, still scarred. For a moment, no one breathed. Then Reeves pressed a small button on the podium. A hush swept through the hall as the old machine crackled to life. At first, there was only static. Then came the faint rhythm of beeps, short Morse code, tapping through the speakers like a heartbeat trying to be remembered. The sound carried across the room, clean and sharp. Someone whispered, "It's still working." The sequence played again, more distinct this time. I felt the hairs on my neck rise. That was the code pattern I had created myself, the emergency beacon unique to our team. No one outside that operation would have recognized it. But someone in that crowd did. An older man near the back of the hall suddenly stood. His hands trembled as he took off his hat, revealing a silver buzz cut. "Those were her codes," he said, his voice breaking. Everyone turned toward him. He wore a veteran's pin and a worn jacket with faded insignia. His eyes found mine. "You saved us, ma'am. Frankfurt 83. I'd know that sound anywhere." The room froze. For a long second, no one spoke. Then the Morse pattern repeated, stronger, filling the air like memory refusing to die. Reeves pressed another button. The machine shifted and the recording continued. My voice cut through the static. Calm, deliberate, carrying the weight of that night. "Transmission complete. Extraction point coordinates confirmed. Repeat, confirmed. Bring them home." The crowd listened in silence. Even the cameras stopped clicking. My voice from 1983 cut through the museum air like a signal from the past. Then, at the very end of the transmission, came a phrase I hadn't remembered saying, a single line buried beneath the noise, so faint it barely existed. "For Charlie team, tell them the song reached the other side." I felt my breath catch. That phrase wasn't part of any official code. It was something personal, a message to one man on the ground, Captain Andrew Keller, the mission lead. It had been our phrase for confirmation, a promise that if one of us didn't make it home, the message would. Hearing it again after all these years felt like being touched by a ghost. The veteran who had stood earlier took a shaky step forward. His voice cracked. "Captain Keller didn't make it, ma'am, but he told us before we boarded the evac chopper, if we ever heard that message again, we'd know she kept her word." Every eye in the room turned to me. I couldn't move. My throat felt too tight for words. I saw flashes of that night, the smoke, the alarms, the trembling hands that kept turning the dial until the signal cut through. For years, I'd thought I'd failed them, that the message hadn't been enough. Now, in that quiet hall filled with strangers and ghosts, I knew it had reached them after all. Reeves's voice broke the silence. Ladies and gentlemen, you've just heard history speak for itself. Applause started softly, hesitant, then swelled until it filled the gallery. Some clapped out of respect, others out of disbelief, maybe both. I stood still, letting the sound wash over me. It didn't feel like glory. It felt like peace finally finding a home. After the ceremony, a few reporters approached, asking questions, their microphones pointed like rifles. How did you feel hearing your voice again after 40 years? What does this mean for women in intelligence history? I gave polite answers, the kind that don't make headlines. It's not about me, I said. It's about what happens when silence stops being enough. One reporter, younger than my grandson, asked quietly, "Do you think the past should always be reopened?" I smiled and said, "Only if it still breathes." As the crowd thinned, I noticed the older veteran still standing by the display, his hand resting against the glass. I walked over. He turned to me, eyes wet. "I never thought I'd see the day, ma'am. We told our families no one would ever know who saved us. I guess now they will." I touched his shoulder lightly. "Sometimes knowing isn't the point," I said. "Sometimes surviving is enough." He nodded, then saluted me, slow and steady. I returned it without thinking. The air between us felt sacred. When he left, Reeves approached. His voice was low. "The department has already contacted us. They want to review the full transmission logs. You might be called in for debriefing." I met his gaze. "After all this time, I can handle one more room full of men with files." He smiled faintly. "You're not alone this time, Mrs. Carter. The board stands with you." That night, I stayed in town. Too many memories were still awake for me to drive home. I walked through the city instead, past the quiet storefronts and the soft reflection of streetlights in puddles. For the first time in years, I felt no need to hide. The story had found its frequency again. Back at the hotel, I sat on the edge of the bed, holding the small radio the museum had gifted me. It wasn't mine, but it felt familiar. I turned the dial gently until the static faded into a clear hum. A woman's voice on a late-night talk show was reading messages sent by veterans across the country. One caught my ear. It said, "To the woman whose signal reached us from the dark, we heard you. We're still listening." My eyes blurred. I turned off the radio and sat there in the silence it left behind. Some stories don't need to be rewritten. They just need to be heard once, clearly, without noise. The signal had finally broken through, but what waited on the other end was not silence. If this story moved you, hit like, share, or subscribe to Military Revenge. Because tomorrow, the call from Washington changes everything. The call came early the next morning. Not from the museum this time, but from a Washington number I hadn't seen in decades. The voice on the other end was firm and official, a tone that hadn't changed since the 80s. "Mrs. Carter, this is Major Stanton from the Department of Defense Records Office. We're requesting your presence in Washington for a classified review concerning the Berlin transmission recovered at the Museum of Intelligence Heritage." It wasn't really a request. It never was. I agreed, packed a small bag, and took the first train south. The landscape outside the window rolled by in shades of gray and brown. Fields, bridges, towns that hadn't changed since the Cold War ended. Funny thing about time, it moves forward for everyone except those whose lives got stuck in sealed files. By the time I reached Union Station, the air in Washington felt heavier. The streets were clean and quiet, the kind of quiet built by power. A black sedan waited near the curb. The driver held a sign with my name, just like old times. No small talk on the ride, just the hum of the engine and the faint smell of leather and new paper. They brought me to a building I knew too well. I'd walked its corridors in another lifetime, back when my clearance badge meant something. Inside, the hallways looked the same: white walls, fluorescent lights, framed photos of men shaking hands in front of flags. The receptionist took my ID, printed a visitor badge, and asked me to wait. 10 minutes later, Major Stanton arrived. Tall, mid-50s, crisp uniform, kind eyes trying not to show sympathy. He led me down a narrow hallway into a briefing room with no windows. A small flag stood in the corner, beside a table with a recorder and 3 folders. 2 other officials were already seated, one from Defense Intelligence, another from the Department of Records. They didn't introduce themselves. They never do. The major gestured for me to sit. "Thank you for coming on short notice, Mrs. Carter. We've reviewed the audio recovered from the museum exhibit. As you're aware, it contains a classified transmission from March 1983, linked to Operation Aurora." I nodded. "I'm aware." He opened one of the folders. "What we didn't expect," he said, "was a secondary layer of code embedded in the signal. We ran a decryption analysis overnight. It contained an encrypted directive, one that doesn't match your mission parameters." I frowned. "Directive? What kind of directive?" I slid a sheet across the table. On it were numbers and symbols I hadn't seen in decades, written in an old cipher format. Stanton continued, "The embedded message was not part of your transmission. It appears to have been inserted automatically by the relay system after your signal left Frankfurt. That didn't make sense. We were operating on manual systems. Nothing could transmit without our input. Unless someone had inserted a secondary relay into the line." The younger analyst spoke for the first time. "According to our review, your radio wasn't the only one active on that frequency that night. A second signal originated from a classified outpost near Potsdam. It was masked as interference." I leaned forward. "You're saying someone piggybacked on my transmission?" "Exactly," he said. "The embedded code contained coordinates, not to the extraction zone, but to a cache location just beyond the East Berlin perimeter." My mind raced. None of that was in our orders. My team's only objective was to get those men out alive. I looked at Stanton. "What was at that cache?" I hesitated. "That's what we're trying to determine. The files related to it were sealed under a separate clearance, Project Halcyon. Ever heard of it?" He shook my head. "No. Never." The older official cleared his throat. "Mrs. Carter, your voice transmission may have been used to mask the activation of another operation, one you were never briefed on." I stared at them. After 40 years, they were still finding new ways to make the truth heavier. Stanton pushed a second folder toward me. Inside was a black and white photograph of a storage crate, half buried in snow. The label stenciled across it read Hail 7C. Beneath the image was a typed note, "Recovered 1989, location redacted." He said quietly, "The code embedded in your signal matches the coordinates for this cache. Whatever was inside that crate was retrieved, and then classified beyond level 10. I don't even have access." The words hit harder than I expected. I wasn't angry, not yet. Just tired of learning that every truth had another locked door behind it. I asked, "So what happens?" "No," Stanton exhaled. "The department intends to review your field notes, and any surviving documentation from that mission. They may ask for your cooperation in reconstructing the original equipment." "Reconstructing? For what purpose?" I hesitated again. "Because someone recently attempted to access the same frequency you used that night. It originated from outside the country, but the pattern was identical." I felt the room tilt slightly. Someone was still listening. The analyst turned the recorder on. "Mrs. Carter, we'd like to ask a few questions about your original encryption methods." I nodded. For the next hour, they walked me through the details: bandwidth, code keys, relay intervals. Most of it came back like muscle memory. When we were done, Stanton closed the folder. He said softly, "The recovered message proves you were the legitimate operator. But it also opens new questions about who used your signal without authorization." I stood slowly, my joints stiff. "Major, I spent half my life thinking my work didn't matter. Now you're telling me it mattered too much." He gave a faint smile. "That's one way to look at it." As he escorted me out, I stopped by the hallway window, overlooking the Pentagon courtyard. The sunlight bounced off the concrete, the same sterile brightness I remembered from debriefings long ago. I thought about that second signal, the one that had hidden inside mine like a shadow. Maybe that was why Reeves's father had buried the whole thing. Maybe he'd known. Outside, I sat on a bench by the reflecting pool. The wind carried the sound of distant sirens and the rustle of flags. My mind was too full to rest. I kept hearing my own voice from the recording calm, focused, and wondered what else had traveled with it. I pulled a small notebook from my bag, one I'd started keeping after the museum. Inside were fragments of memory, dates, and call signs. On one page, I wrote a single line: if my signal carried another message, who was it meant for? As I stared at the page, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. The message read, "They were never after the soldiers. They were after what you hid." My heart stills. I looked around the courtyard, half expecting someone to be watching. No one was. I typed back, "Who is this?" No reply. I sat there for a long while, phone in hand, wind cutting through my coat. Somewhere deep inside, that old instinct I thought I'd buried woke up again. The part of me that once listened for signals no one else could hear. When I finally stood, I whispered to the wind, "You're not done with me yet, are you?" Minnie Hook, the past doesn't echo, it transmits. And this time, someone else is tuning in. If this story kept you listening, tap like or subscribe to Military Revenge. The next chapter will take us back to where it all began, Berlin, 1983, and reveal what that second signal was hiding. The morning of the ceremony arrived with a thin layer of fog resting over the city. I hadn't planned to attend again, but a message from Reeves changed my mind. He said the museum was hosting a second gathering, a formal dedication, now that the department had verified the transmission. He didn't say much else, only that it would matter if I were there. When I reached the museum steps, I saw more people than before. Veterans in pressed uniforms, families holding flowers, reporters trying to stay quiet out of respect. Inside, the main hall had been transformed. The radio now sat in a glass case surrounded by photographs from the rescue mission, recently declassified. For the first time, my name appeared on the small metal plaque beneath the display: Lisa Carter, U.S. Army Signal Intelligence Division, Operation Aurora, 1983. I stood at the back, hands clasped, watching people read the label. A few nodded quietly. Most just stared. Reeves spotted me and came over. His voice was calm but carried something new: regret that had turned into understanding. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I think today might bring some closure." Before I could answer, the ceremony began. The museum director spoke first, followed by a local official. Their words floated over the crowd like practiced hymns. When Reeves stepped up to the microphone, the room fell silent. He paused, looking out at the faces before him, then began. He said his father had dedicated his life to preserving military history, to honoring those who served in silence. Then he stopped, his voice catching slightly. "What he didn't say, what I didn't understand until now, is that sometimes silence hides the wrong things." He looked toward me. "There's a name missing from every story my father ever told. A name that should have been spoken 40 years ago. That name is Lisa Carter." The audience turned, and I felt every eye on me. Reeves continued, "She built the device that transmitted the coordinates, saving 6 American lives during the Berlin crisis. My father reported the operation as his own, but the truth, the real truth, belongs to her." A murmur rippled through the room. Some of the older veterans leaned forward. Reeves's voice softened. "I can't undo what my father did, but I can make sure this room remembers correctly." The air felt heavy, but not in a painful way. It was the weight that comes before release. I didn't move. I didn't need to. The front, an elderly man slowly rose from his seat. His movements were shaky but determined. The medals on his coat caught the light as he steadied himself on a cane. When he spoke, his voice trembled, but every word carried strength. "She was the one," he said. "She saved us." Whispers filled the hall, some in disbelief, others in awe. The man turned to face me, eyes bright despite the years. "I was with Charlie team. We thought no one could hear us. But your signal cut through the wall that night. We made it home because of you." For a moment, the room blurred. The applause came slow, hesitant at first, then grew until it filled every corner. I wanted to disappear and stay forever at the same time. Reeves stepped back from the podium, letting the sound settle. When it quieted, he turned to me. "Mrs. Carter, would you like to say something?" Shook my head gently. The crowd waited. I walked to the front, the click of my shoes echoing against the floor. Standing beside the glass case, I looked down at the radio, old, scratched, dented. "The same one I'd touched with trembling hands all those years ago," I said. It was never about credit, it was about the signal getting through. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of understanding, the kind that doesn't need applause or ceremony. Then I added, "They erased my file, but they couldn't erase the frequency." That line hung in the air longer than I expected. Some people lowered their heads. Others nodded, tears glinting in their eyes. Even Reeves stood frozen, his jaw set but his eyes damped. Afterward, people came forward to shake my hand, to thank me, to tell me stories about their own forgotten missions. One woman said her father had been in Berlin during the extraction. He never talked about it, but he always kept a small radio by his bed. I smiled and told her maybe he just wanted to keep listening. When the crowd thinned, Reeves approached again. He looked lighter, as if a weight he didn't even know he carried had been lifted. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just hope the truth brings you peace." I told him peace isn't something you find. It's something that answers when you stop running from what's true. Outside, the fog had lifted. Sunlight spilled across the museum steps, touching the flag that hung above the entrance. I stood for a long moment, letting the warmth reach my face. The air carried the faint hum of traffic, the chatter of tourists, the rhythm of a city that had no idea it was standing on buried signals. For the first time in decades, I felt like I could breathe fully. Minnie Hook, sometimes justice doesn't need a courtroom. It just needs a clear frequency. If this story spoke to you, like and share it. And subscribe to Military Revenge for the final chapter, when the truth behind Project Halcyon finally surfaces. When the last of the guests left the museum, I found a quiet corner near the service hallway, away from the chatter of journalists packing up their cameras. The hum of the air system was steady, almost like a pulse. I stood there for a while just breathing, until a soft voice behind me said, "You still listen for signals, don't you?" He turned. The old general who had spoken during the ceremony stood a few steps away, leaning slightly on his cane. Without the stage lights, he looked older, smaller, but his eyes were sharp and steady. I told him I used to listen for them, now I just hear the echoes. He nodded. "That's all any of us do at the end." Echoes. He gestured toward a bench near the exhibit and said, "Sit with me for a minute." I did. For a while we both watched the reflection of the radio in the glass. He broke the silence first. "I served under Colonel Reeves during that operation," he said. "You should know that." I remembered his name now, General Thompson. He'd been the field commander in West Germany at the time. Reeves reported directly to him, and the two were inseparable on paper. He sighed. "We were told Operation Aurora was a rescue mission. 6 men trapped, enemy advancing, high risk. But there was another file, locked under a different code name. Project Halcyon. I was briefed only once, and even then, half of it was redacted." I stayed quiet, waiting. He continued, "The night you transmitted the coordinates, there was another order sent on the same frequency. It was meant to activate a transfer, something hidden behind the wall." I looked at him. "What kind of transfer?" Hesitated, then said, "Not people. Information. A list of names, double agents, sleeper cells, operatives from both sides. Someone high up had arranged a trade." "Levs for leverage." The words hung in the air like frost. I asked, "Are you saying my transmission carried both?" Nodded slowly. "Your signal reached the extraction team, yes, but it also triggered the second phase of Halcyon. Reeves knew. That's why he buried your file. He couldn't let anyone trace the dual signal back to him." For a long moment, I said nothing. Part of me wanted to believe he was wrong, that the night I thought I saved lives hadn't also delivered others into danger. But I remembered the second frequency Stanton mentioned in Washington. The interference, the piggyback code. Thompson continued. "Reeves wasn't a monster, but he was ambitious. The trade secured his promotion. When the wall fell, the documents were supposed to be destroyed. Instead, someone archived them. Maybe he thought he could control the story forever. I asked, "And you? Why tell me this?" No looked down at his hands. "Because I don't have forever. And because I saw what it did to him, carrying a lie that long." He paused, breathing slow. "I read the file again last night before I came here. The names on that list, some were saved, some weren't. But the world that came after needed both. What you did still mattered." I wanted to ask more, but his hand trembled, and I could see the effort it took just to keep his voice steady. He said, "There's a copy of the Halcyon Directive sealed in the National Archives. If you want to see it, tell them I gave you clearance. But think before you do. Some truths don't set you free, they just rearrange the chains." He rose slowly, resting his cane against the bench. I stood to help him, but he waved me off. "Don't carry this alone, Carter. You already carried more than your share." I watched him walk away down the corridor, each step echoing softly until the sound faded. When he disappeared around the corner, I turned back toward the display. The radio sat in its glass box, silent as stone. My reflection overlapped with it again, just like the first time I saw it. For a moment, I imagined the signal still pulsing somewhere in the air, the one I sent and the one I never meant to. The museum lights dimmed as the staff began closing for the night. I stayed until the last one passed by to lock up, then stepped outside. The evening had turned crisp, the city lights flickering through a light mist. I started walking with no real direction, my thoughts heavier with every block. Halfway down the street, I stopped at a small cafe still open on the corner. The kind of place that smelled like burnt coffee and old jazz. I sat at the counter, ordered tea, and unfolded a napkin just to have something to do with my hands. I wrote one line across it: "The truth isn't a weapon, it's a weight." As I stared at the words, I realized I had a choice. I could go to the archives, open the sealed file, and pull every secret back into the light. Or I could leave it buried, let history keep its imperfect balance. One path meant justice, maybe. The other meant peace. The door opened behind me, and cold air brushed my shoulders. Reeve stepped in, still in his dark coat. He saw me, nodded, and took the seat beside mine. He didn't speak at first. Then he said quietly, "The general told you, didn't he?" Nodded. He looked down at the counter. "I found a letter in my father's belongings after he died. He wrote that he never meant for Halcyon to happen the way it did. That he had orders, but he crossed a line trying to protect his career. He wrote your name at the end. Said you deserved better." I asked if he'd ever told anyone. He shook his head. No one would have believed him. Not then. I studied his face. He looked like a man caught between guilt and gratitude. I said, "You have a chance to fix what he couldn't." He nodded slowly. "Maybe I already started. The museum will add Halcyon to its archive. Not the whole story, but enough." We finished our tea in silence. When I stood to leave, he asked, "Will you go after the file?" He smiled faintly. "Maybe. But not tonight." Outside, the city hummed with the sound of traffic and distant sirens. I walked past the glowing windows, the air sharp in my lungs. For years I'd been searching for validation. Now I realized the truth I carried didn't belong to any one person or file. It belonged to the signal that refused to die. As I reached the corner, I looked up at the faint glow of an antenna on a nearby rooftop. It blinked once, twice, steady and patient. I whispered, "They erased my file, but they couldn't erase the frequency." And for the first time, that felt like enough. Many hooks, sometimes the truth doesn't demand to be told. It just needs to be carried by someone who remembers the sound. If this story stayed with you, hit like or subscribe to Military Revenge. The next chapter uncovers what happened to Project Halcyon's final transmission and the cost of one last signal. The letter arrived on a Monday morning, folded neatly inside a plain envelope, stamped with the Department of Defense seal. There was no return address, just my name typed in clean black ink. Inside was a single page confirming what I thought would never happen. My service identification number had been reinstated. My records had been restored to active historical status. It meant one simple thing. The government finally acknowledged that I had served. For a long while I just stared at the letter. It was quiet in the house. The coffee sat untouched, steam curling toward the light. 40 years of silence had become a habit. Recognition felt foreign, like hearing a song you'd almost forgotten, but somehow still knew every note. I folded the letter and placed it beside the old radio part I kept on my shelf. The same one I had built with my own hands in a concrete bunker outside Frankfurt. The metal was cold, but for the first time in years, it felt light. A week later, the museum invited me back. This time, not for a ceremony about history but for a small gathering to honor what they called correction of record. I hesitated before agreeing. Part of me wanted to let it end quietly. But another part knew that silence was how this had all started. Some truths needed to be spoken out loud, even if only once. When I arrived, the same marble foyer that once made me feel small now looked different. Familiar, human. A small group of people stood near the exhibit. Reeves greeted me with a genuine smile, the kind that doesn't hide behind duty. He said the department had approved a full restoration of my file. Then he handed me a new identification badge enclosed in a clear case. It read, Lisa Carter, Signal Intelligence Officer, Cold War Division. The title looked strange beside my name. I hadn't been called an officer since the 80s. For a moment, I felt 20 again, standing at a steel desk with static in my ears and adrenaline in my hands. Reeves said softly, "You should have had this all along." I told him, maybe it found me when I was ready to hold it. The ceremony was simple. No reporters, no speeches written by staff. Just a few museum officials, a handful of veterans, and the general sitting in the front row, his cane resting against his knee. They asked me to speak last. I didn't prepare anything. When I stepped up to the small podium, the air was calm. I looked at the faces in front of me, some young, some weathered, all waiting for something honest. I said, "I didn't come for an apology. I came so the truth would find its frequency." The words came naturally, as if they had been waiting all these years. I spoke about how silence can protect, but it can also bury. How honor doesn't belong to those who shout the loudest, but to those who keep sending their signal even when no one is listening. I said the world had changed since the Cold War, but the need for integrity hadn't. When I finished, the room was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels alive. Then the general stood, lifted his hand, and saluted. Others followed. I didn't move at first. My throat tightened, my eyes blurred. After a second, I returned the salute. It wasn't for rank or recognition. It was for the people who never stopped believing that truth mattered, even when no one was watching. Afterward, Reeves handed me a small velvet box. Inside was a silver badge engraved with a frequency line running through the center. He said it was custom-made for the museum's new permanent exhibit. Below the frequency, a single phrase was etched into the metal. The signal got through. I closed the box carefully. That was all I ever wanted to know, that somewhere, somehow, the message had made it home. Sometimes justice arrives quietly, not as a medal, but as a frequency finally heard. If this moment resonated with you, like and subscribe to Military Revenge. The next part reveals what the final signal carried, a message hidden for decades, meant for one person only. After the small ceremony ended, most people drifted out to the museum courtyard, where sunlight poured through the tall glass atrium. I lingered near the exhibit, watching the reflections on the radio's glass case shift with every passing cloud. The general had left his seat empty, his cane propped against the chair as if he meant to come back. Reeves walked up quietly and said, "There's one more thing you should hear." He led me down a hallway marked Archives, authorized access only. The door required both our badges. Inside, the air was colder, filled with the faint hum of servers and preservation machines. Metal shelves stretched into the distance, stacked with files and magnetic reels labeled in faded ink. Reeves handed me a pair of headphones. This was found when the Defense Department digitized the old Aurora transmissions. He paused as if weighing his next words. The last few seconds were redacted for years. Now they've been cleared. He set the reel-to-reel machine to play. The tape hissed softly before the familiar rhythm of Morse code filled the air. I closed my eyes. Each pulse was as clear as it had been that night in 1983. The sequence ended with my voice calm, composed, reading the coordinates. Then, after a brief crackle, another voice came through. It was low, tired, and steady. "Sergeant, this is Captain Dean Mercer, Charlie Team. If this transmission reaches anyone, tell them she got us out." The static swallowed half his words, but the next ones cut through clean. "Tell her we heard the signal. Tell her it saved us." I gripped the edge of the table. Dean Mercer had been one of the 6 men extracted from East Berlin. I'd never met him in person. We'd only spoken through coded bursts of light and sound. To hear his voice after 40 years was like being pulled backward through time. Reeves stood quietly beside me, his hands folded behind his back. The recording continued. Mercer's voice grew fainter. "They told me the operator was lost, that she never made it back. But if this reaches her, tell her I owe her more than life. Tell her she didn't just send coordinates. She sent us home." The tape clicked, then went silent. Reeves looked at me and said softly, "There's a timestamp on that message. It was sent 3 hours after the official log said the line was cut." Meaning he risked broadcasting when the channel was already compromised. He wanted to make sure it reached you, even if it cost him. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. I asked if they knew what happened to Mercer after the rescue. Reeves checked a note in the file. He stayed in service for another decade, retired quietly, and passed away in 2001. He never spoke publicly about the operation. I sat there for a long moment, the headphones still warm in my hands. The machine whirred softly, rewinding the tape. The room smelled faintly of metal and paper, old truth and dust mixed together. Reeves said, "We can add the message to the museum archive if you want." I shook my head. "Not yet. Some things are meant to be listened to, not displayed." He nodded in understanding and left me alone in the room. I replayed the last part again, just to hear it one more time. The hiss, the static, then that final line, "She sent us home." I thought about all the years between then and now, about the moments I almost gave up believing it mattered. And suddenly, it did. Not because anyone finally believed me, but because someone always had. I removed the headphones and placed them gently on the table. For the first time in decades, the sound of silence didn't feel heavy. It felt earned. As I left the archive, I passed the museum's new plaque near the entrance. It listed the names of the Aurora team. Under Signal Intelligence, there was only one line: Lisa Carter. Beneath it, a smaller engraving read, "The frequency that found its way home." Outside, the evening light was soft and gold. The air smelled like rain and cut grass. The kind of scent that makes you stop without knowing why. I walked across the courtyard and sat on a low stone wall near the fountain. The world moved around me: tourists, traffic, laughter, but none of it intruded. I reached into my bag and took out the small velvet box with the silver badge inside. The line etched through it caught the fading light. I traced it with my finger, thinking about all the voices carried through that narrow band of sound. So many are gone. So many are remembered only by the echoes they left. Then I heard a faint vibration in my pocket. A text from Reeves. He wrote, "We finished restoring the last Aurora file. There's a second message hidden under Mercer's voice. A harmonic pattern, faint but there. Want to hear it?" He typed back, "Maybe tomorrow. Tonight I just want to listen to the quiet." He replied, "Understood. The frequency will wait." I smiled at that. The signal will wait. I looked up at the darkening sky, the first stars emerging like dots of code against an endless field. Somewhere out there, invisible waves still carried the echoes of our transmissions, crossing oceans and mountains, bouncing between satellites and clouds. Maybe that was how memory really worked, not fading, just moving farther out of range until someone tuned in again. A soft breeze brushed past, carrying the sound of a flag snapping somewhere nearby. I closed my eyes and whispered, "Thank you, Captain Mercer, for hearing me when no one else did." The fountain bubbled steadily, like static at the edge of transmission. The city lights flickered on, one by one, each a tiny pulse of life finding its way through the dark. Some stories don't end with medals or ceremonies. They end with a frequency that never dies. If this story touched something in you, hit like or subscribe to Military Revenge. The next story follows another forgotten signal from a Navy codebreaker whose final message rewrote the meaning of loyalty. When I look back now, I realize that everything I ever did came down to a single choice. Not the missions or the codes, not the secrets buried in locked rooms, but the decision to keep sending a signal when the world stopped listening. That's what service really is. You transmit who you are long after the war is over. Some send courage, some send fear, some silence. What you choose to send becomes the legacy you leave behind. For years, I thought my signal had vanished somewhere between the noise and the lies. But standing in that museum, hearing my own voice echo across decades, I understood something simple and human. The frequency was never lost. It was just waiting for the right ears to find it. We all carry signals inside us, memories of people who stood their ground quietly, who fought invisible battles, who were never thanked out loud. Sometimes the bravest stories are the ones no one heard in real time. The war changed us, but silence shaped us. And yet, even silence has a sound if you listen close enough. It's in the way an old soldier folds a flag. It's in the way a daughter stands tall when her father's name is called. It's in the quiet between the static, where truth still lives. If this story reminds you of someone whose service was forgotten, share it, because sometimes honor needs a signal booster, and you might be at dot. And if you believe the world still needs stories like this, stories that remind us that courage doesn't fade with age or time, then like this video and subscribe to Military Revenge. Because every signal, no matter how faint, deserves to be heard.